Modern love is sold as a promise of completeness, as if another person had the power to fill the voids we carry within ourselves. But what if this were just a comfortable illusion? Nietzsche invites us to distrust grand narratives about love, because for him, human desire was never just purity or surrender, but also struggle, selfishness, and the need for power. The love we idealize might actually be a prison where we project our deepest needs. What if loving were less about finding someone and more about confronting the abyss within ourselves? Are we prepared to face that behind sweet words and eternal promises there might exist a game of domination disguised as tenderness? This is the provocation that guides our journey. If this reflection awakens something in you, subscribe to the channel and follow us as we dive into the uncomfortable truths Nietzsche left us. When we think of love, we almost always imagine something pure, generous, made of surrender and devotion. We believe that loving means placing the other above ourselves, yielding, renouncing, living for the sake of a promise of eternity. But Nietzsche forces us to look at this feeling with different eyes. For him, love is not a renunciation, but an affirmation of one's own will. It is desire, it is force, it is a struggle for recognition and dominance. What we call love can often be merely the most delicate mask that the will to power has found to express itself. Nietzsche did not see human beings as naturally altruistic. On the contrary, in every gesture of affection, in every oath of eternal love, he perceived traces of selfishness, of seeking affirmation, of the need to be important to the other. Loving, in this sense, is not just giving oneself, but conquering a privileged place in the heart and mind of the beloved. It is demanding exclusivity. It is claiming space. It is wanting the other to belong to us, even if silently. The sweetness of love can hide the hardness of possession. If we look at everyday relationships, we see how this manifests. Who has never felt jealous seeing their partner smile at a stranger? Who has never demanded more attention, more time, more words of affection? Love, when observed closely, shows that it is not only about giving, but also, and perhaps mainly, about receiving. We want to be loved, admired, chosen, and we suffer when this doesn't happen. The promise of generosity mixes with a secret demand. I want to be special to you. I want the world to revolve around my value. Nietzsche did not condemn this as a moral error, but as an inevitable reality of life. The will to power is the force that moves humans. It is the impulse to grow, conquer, expand. Love, therefore, is just another way to exercise this impulse. We love to feel that we are indispensable, to ensure we will not be forgotten, to dominate, even if subtly, the heart of the other. Love, under this lens, ceases to be pure sacrifice and reveals itself as a game of forces, a dance where each tries to maintain their position of power. This view may seem cruel, but it is liberating. It forces us to abandon illusions. How many people enter relationships believing that love will make them complete? How many surrender, believing that the other will save them from their most intimate pains? By perceiving that love is also a dispute of forces, we can better understand our conflicts, our frustrations, our demands. It is not about hating love, but seeing it realistically, without the romantic makeup that culture insists on putting over it. Nietzsche goes so far as to affirm that love is often the instinct of possession intensified. We love not only because we admire, but because we desire to capture the other's energy, transform it into part of us. We cannot stand the idea that the one we love is too free, too distant, too autonomous. We want closeness, yes, but we also want control. Jealousy is not a flaw of love, but its natural consequence, because it is born from this desire for exclusivity. In practice, we see couples who say they live for each other, but who in truth are only defending their emotional territory. Those who insist they cannot live without the other, are deep down confessing a dependence that has more to do with fear of loss than with generosity. Nietzsche pushes us to see these uncomfortable truths. To love is also to want to imprison. It is also to want to hold. It is also to fight against the anguish of solitude. But if love is will to power, does this mean we should reject it? Not necessarily. For Nietzsche, the question is not to deny reality, but to learn to deal with it without illusions. Recognizing love as a struggle of forces is the first step to not falling into the traps of naivety. When we know that loving is also disputing, we can transform this dispute into something conscious, less destructive. We can admit our needs for power without masking them as sacrifice. And there is unexpected beauty in this view, because contrary to the idea of love as total renunciation, Nietzsche shows us that loving can be an expression of vitality. Desiring the other, fighting for the other, wanting them to be part of our life is also a sign of strength, of intensity, of affirmation of one's own existence. The risk lies in believing that this desire is pure generosity, when, in truth, it is a game of forces that needs to be assumed with clarity. Thus, modern love, so idealized in songs, movies, and promises, reveals its rawest face. Behind romanticism, there is a human heart that desires to be remembered, valued, and ultimately necessary. Loving is, therefore, an act of power. Not in the sense of violent oppression, but of affirmation of life itself. What Nietzsche asks of us is courage to look at love without veils, to understand that even in the sweetest of passions, we are still moved by the will to expand ourselves, dominate and survive in the memory of the other. Deep down, perhaps love is one of the most sophisticated forms of struggle for eternity. We don't just want to be loved today, we want to be unforgettable tomorrow. We live surrounded by narratives that convince us that love is the key to life. From childhood, we hear stories where happiness only comes true when meeting one's soulmate. Movies, songs, and novels reinforce this idea. Someone will come, and this someone will have the power to complete what we lack. But Nietzsche invites us to be suspicious. For him, this promise of completeness is nothing but an illusion, a convenient escape from ourselves. Romantic love, so celebrated, can be a mask that covers the difficulty of facing one's own solitude. We seek in the other what we cannot sustain in ourselves. We seek to be saved, to be rescued from a void that haunts us. And thus, we create the image of love as a kind of redemption, a hope that absolves us from facing life in its rawness. We love not only because we desire, but because we fear what we are when we are alone. Nietzsche saw this as a sign of weakness. For him, the individual who cannot bear their own company is condemned to transform love into dependence. When we place on the other the mission of healing our wounds, we inevitably transform them into medicine and not into a partner. And medicines, as we know, are consumed until they are exhausted. Thus, relationships born from need tend to crumble under the weight of unrealistic expectation. Think about how many people lose themselves when they fall in love. How many change their habits, their tastes, their friendships, their routines, just to mold themselves to the other's desire. The relationship ceases to be an encounter of two forces and becomes a process of dissolution. We believe this is true love, but, in the Nietzschean view, it is escape. We flee from our individuality because it seems too heavy. We place on the other the task of sustaining what we cannot carry alone. This pattern intensifies in modern love. Social media, dating apps, and the culture of exhibition reinforce the belief that we will only be valued if we are accompanied. There is subtle but constant pressure. Being single is a sign of failure. Being in a couple is proof of victory. This mentality pushes us towards superficial relationships, often rushed, where fear of solitude speaks louder than genuine desire. Nietzsche, if alive, might smile ironically seeing how society reinforces this emotional slavery. But why do we seek so much this illusion of completeness? Because it is easier to believe that there exists a lost half than to face the reality that we are unfinished, fragmented, complex beings. The myth of the soulmate spares us from the arduous work of maturing alone. It is more comfortable to wait for someone to come and with their presence solve our incompleteness. However, this hope infantilizes us. We transform love into a magical promise, and every time it doesn't correspond to this promise, we feel betrayed. Nietzsche proposes another path, to love without expecting salvation. This means abandoning the fantasy of love as a cure and accepting it as an encounter of forces, not as anesthesia for life's pains. Instead of seeking in the other an escape, we must learn to endure ourselves. Only those who know and accept themselves are capable of loving without transforming the relationship into prison. Love, then, ceases to be a refuge against solitude and becomes a celebration of two whole beings who do not need but choose to share. This vision forces us to face uncomfortable truths. How many times do we say, "I can't live without you," without realizing we are decreeing our own slavery? How many times do we justify jealousy and possessiveness as proof of love, when in reality they reveal fear and insecurity? The romantic illusion teaches us to romanticize weakness. When Nietzsche calls us to seek strength, he believed that the greatness of love can only flourish when two free souls meet. And freedom in this case is not absence of bonds, but the capacity to remain whole before the other, to love without losing oneself, to love without depending, to love without transforming the other into a crutch. Only then does love cease to be escape and becomes affirmation of life. Deep down, Nietzsche offers us a disturbing question. Do we love because we really desire, or because we cannot bear being alone? If the answer is the second, we are living an illusion. Love in this case is not expression of vitality, but a disguise for our inability to face inner silence. Perhaps this is why so many modern relationships fail. We place on the other an impossible weight to be the solution to our abysses. When the illusion breaks, we feel betrayed, when in reality we were the ones who created the lie. The trap was not in love, but in our unrealistic expectations. Nietzsche asks us for courage to abandon this illusion. To love is not to complete oneself in the other, but to overflow what we already are. And only those who face their own solitude without fear are capable of loving without imprisoning, without transforming the other into a mirror of their needs. True love, then, is not born from lack, but from abundance. If modern love already shows itself as an illusion of completeness, it harbors yet another more subtle and destructive trap: resentment. Nietzsche saw resentment as a corrosive force, born from the inability to affirm one's own life. It is the poison that arises when we cannot directly express our desires and frustrations, and then transform them into complaints, veiled accusations, a game of blame. In love, this dynamic appears with intensity, often masked as passion. At first glance, resentment disguises itself as zeal, care, even romantic intensity. That partner who controls every step, who demands proof of fidelity, who dramatizes every silence, often believes they are acting out of love. But what is at stake, according to Nietzsche, is not the generosity of passion, but fear of losing power over the other. Resentment is born from weakness, and that is why it clings so strongly to loving relationships. Where there is dependence, there is vulnerability, and where there is vulnerability, sooner or later, resentment will arise. In small daily gestures, this poison infiltrates. That heavy silence after an argument is not just anger, but the attempt to punish the other with the absence of words. That ironic comment about an apparently trivial attitude is not just humor, but a hidden accusation. Resentment functions as disguised revenge, a way to return the pain one feels without directly acknowledging one's own wound. Nietzsche saw in resentment a sign of weak spirit. The strong individual expresses their will directly, does not fear affirming their desires, does not hide behind manipulations. The resentful individual, on the other hand, cannot act clearly. They accumulate grudges, cultivate painful memories, repeat demands that never end. In love, this becomes an invisible prison. The relationship begins to revolve not around creating something new, but around the endless repetition of old wounds. Let's think of a couple where one betrayed the other. Often, even after being forgiven, the episode is remembered indefinitely, becoming a weapon to keep the other under control. Forgiveness is never complete, because there was no strength to really overcome it. Resentment in this case is stronger than love, and the relationship becomes a silent battlefield where both pretend harmony while exchanging small emotional stabs. Nietzsche denounced this dynamic because it destroys not only love, but the very vitality of the individual. Living in resentment is living turned backward, trapped in the past, unable to create something new. It is the negation of life in its potency. And in love, this stagnation is deadly. It kills desire, suffocates admiration, transforms the partner into an intimate enemy. Passion, which should be creative fire, becomes a flame of resentment that slowly consumes both sides. The most dangerous thing is that resentment can be confused with loving intensity. Many believe that who loves demands, that who loves suffers, that who loves requires proof. These phrases, so common, are reflections of a poisoned mentality. We confuse jealousy with love, control with care, hurt with proof of intensity. Nietzsche dismantles this confusion by showing that true love does not need to feed on resentments. On the contrary, it is only possible when inner strength is great enough not to depend on small emotional revenges. And here the question arises, why are so many modern relationships marked by resentments? Because they start, from the beginning, with unrealistic expectations and dependencies. When we enter a relationship believing that the other is responsible for our happiness, any failure becomes unbearable. We expect the partner to be perfect, and when inevitably they fail, we keep the disappointment as a weapon. Resentment is the price of romantic illusion. The greater the initial fantasy, the greater the hurt when it breaks. Nietzsche proposes another path, an affirmative love that does not deny life in its imperfection, but accepts it. This means recognizing that the other is flawed, that we ourselves are flawed, and still choosing to love without imprisoning. In affirmative love, there is no space for resentments because there is no expectation of perfection. What exists is the celebration of vitality, even with its pains, contradictions, and failures. Liberating oneself from resentment requires courage. It requires abandoning the role of victim and taking responsibility for our own pain. It means stopping blaming the other for not filling our voids and facing the truth. Each one is responsible for themselves. Loving, in this sense, is not demanding, but overflowing. It is not eternally charging for what was lacking, but creating from what exists. Nietzsche provokes us to look at our relationships and ask, what we call passion, wouldn't it be in reality resentment disguised as love? How many times do we prolong relationships not out of desire, but out of fear of losing, feeding a cycle of grudges that poisons us inside? Resentment is perhaps the greatest enemy of modern love because it presents itself as care but acts as silent poison. Deep down, truly loving requires strength. Strength not to depend, strength not to accumulate grudges, strength to affirm life even when it doesn't correspond to our fantasies. And only those who are strong can look at love without transforming each disappointment into revenge, each failure into punishment, each silence into war. Loving without resentment is perhaps the most difficult and most liberating task that Nietzsche proposes to us. Nietzsche believed that the true test of a human being's strength was not in their capacity to lose themselves in love, but in their ability to endure their own solitude. For him, solitude was not punishment, but a field of cultivation. Only those who can remain alone, in contact with their own abysses, are capable of loving without imprisoning, without transforming the other into an object of dependence. Solitude, far from being a void, can become a space of power. Modern society, however, fears solitude. We are taught from an early age to believe that being alone is failure, that a person's value lies in being desired, accompanied, admired. This fear creates a desperate race for relationships, often initiated not by genuine desire, but by panic of absence. And as Nietzsche would warn, those who love to escape solitude do not truly love, they only take refuge, only seek a temporary antidote against the silence they cannot bear. True Nietzschean solitude is something else. It is the courage to remain with oneself, to confront oneself without distractions, to endure the inner silences we usually try to muffle with external noise. It is in this space that we discover who we are, what our desires are, what our strengths and weaknesses are, and it is only from this clarity that we can love without transforming the other into emotional crutch. Nietzsche had horror for dependent love, that in which the subject says, "Without you I am nothing." For him, this type of declaration revealed weakness and self-annihilation. True love should be born from excess of life, from abundance, and not from lack. And who can live this excess? Only those who learn to be whole in solitude. Imagine two people entering a relationship. One of them cannot bear being alone, constantly needs the other's presence, messages, attention, proof of affection. The other, on the contrary, knows how to be alone, does not fear silence, does not depend on constant assurances, does not transform each absence into a sign of abandonment. Which one will have more chance of living free love? Obviously, the second. Because love is only light when it is not born from the need to fill holes, but from the desire to share abundances. Nietzsche, in valuing solitude, was not preaching eternal isolation. He did not suggest that we should reject bonds. On the contrary, he believed that life is made of encounters, but authentic encounters are only possible when two whole forces meet. Loving from solitude is not refusing the other, but receiving them maturely, without projecting onto them the impossible mission of saving us from ourselves. This perspective forces us to reflect on our own relationship with solitude. How many of us really endure being alone, without distractions, without the escape of social media, without the need for another who confirms us? How many can spend a weekend in silence without feeling the anguish of not being seen? Love, in the Nietzschean view, begins there, when we are capable of facing the inner desert and still remain standing. There is an emblematic passage where Nietzsche states that the loneliest individual is also the strongest. Not because they despise others, but because they learned not to need them as crutches. This strength makes the encounter something different, no longer a fusion that annihilates, but an approach that enriches. When two full solitudes meet, love ceases to be prison and becomes creation. In daily life, this translates into small things. The partner who doesn't panic when the other needs space. The person who doesn't demand to be present in every detail of the loved one's life, but respects their individuality. The couple who can spend time apart without this becoming a threat. These signs reveal a love born from well-lived solitude, a love that doesn't need to shout possession because it trusts itself. Nietzsche believed that solitude is the field where true free love is born. Only those who traverse inner silence discover they don't need the other to survive. And paradoxically, it is exactly because of this that they can love more deeply, because they don't love to survive, but but to overflow. Perhaps the greatest lesson here is that solitude is not love's enemy, but its prerequisite. Love born from fleeing solitude is fragile, full of resentments and unrealistic expectations. But love born from well-lived solitude is powerful because it doesn't depend, doesn't imprison, doesn't demand more than it can receive. It is not begging, it is generosity. Nietzsche provokes us to ask, do we endure our own solitude, or are we just running from ourselves through the other? The answer to this question defines not only the quality of our relationships, but the intensity of our own life. Because in the end, only those who are self-sufficient are capable of truly loving. So far we have seen how love can be a mask of the will to power, an illusion of completeness, or even a field poisoned by resentment. Nietzsche, however, did not want us to abandon love. His invitation is not to deny, but to transform. Love, when born from strength and not from need, can become one of the most grandiose expressions of life. It is at this point that he speaks to us about a love that liberates, a love that doesn't imprison, doesn't suffocate, doesn't demand, a love that overflows. The key to understanding this love lies in a radical change of perspective. Instead of loving to fill a void, loving to express abundance. Those who love themselves, who already endure their solitude, who find value in their own life, do not seek in the other a crutch. They seek a dance partner, not a cane, and this difference changes everything. Dependent love is always marked by demands, proof of affection, attention requirements, constant confirmations. It functions as a secret contract where each gesture must correspond to an expectation. Free love demands none of this. It is not based on lack, but on the will to offer. Loving in this sense is giving without expecting return, sharing without accounting, rejoicing in the other's freedom. Nietzsche did not believe in love that was fusion or submission. He believed in love of forces. For him, life is movement, expansion, creation, and true love should accompany this flow. When two people meet from this energy, the relationship ceases to be a space of demands and becomes a space of creation. It is no longer what you do for me, but what we create together from what we already are. This free love manifests in simple but powerful attitudes. It is the capacity to rejoice in the other's growth, even when they don't depend on us. It is not feeling threatened by autonomy, but on the contrary, vibrating with it. It is not transforming difference into distance, but into opportunity for discovery. It is love that doesn't fear space, because it knows the bond doesn't depend on vigilance, but on continuous choice. Nietzsche saw this love as the highest form of human relationship because it requires inner strength. Only those who are not afraid of losing are capable of loving without imprisoning. Only those who already recognize themselves as sufficient are capable of seeing the other as freedom and not as possession. This vision breaks with the logic of romantic love, which so often pushes us toward relationships based on invisible contracts, where each gesture is charged as debt. In practice, this means that liberating love is, paradoxically, the most lasting. Relationships founded on dependence wear out over time, because no one can stand living as another's medicine. Free love continuously renews itself because it is not burden, it is celebration. It doesn't ask for guarantees, doesn't demand eternity, doesn't base itself on unreachable promises. It simply happens here and now in the intensity of two beings who chose to be together without needing this to survive. But Nietzsche doesn't romanticize this path. He knows that loving like this is difficult. It requires abandoning attachment, jealousy, the desire for control. It requires accepting that the other can leave at any moment and still continuing to choose to love. This is an exercise in courage, perhaps the most radical of all. Loving without guarantees, without securities, without eternal contracts. loving not as possession, but as affirmation of life. Many reject this idea because it seems fragile, unstable. But, in reality, it is the opposite. Nothing is stronger than free love. Because in it, there is no prison, and where there is no prison, there is no resentment. Where there is no impossible expectation, there is no paralyzing frustration. Love that liberates is therefore purer, more vital, more human. It is an encounter that doesn't pretend eternity, but sustains itself in the intensity of the present. Nietzsche invites us to think what would happen if we loved without expecting return. If we saw the other not as someone who should complete us, but as someone who walks beside us. What would change in our relationships if we left aside the language of possession and adopted the language of creation? Perhaps we would discover that love, when it is not prison, can be the most beautiful form of shared freedom. In the end, love that liberates is the opposite of dependence. It is the affirmation of two whole lives that meet not to cover holes, but to expand horizons. And this love, born from excess and not from lack, is what Nietzsche considered truly worthy of human greatness. We reach the point where Nietzsche offers us not only criticism, but possibility of reconstruction. If modern love has become a trap, full of illusions of completeness, silent resentments, and suffocating dependencies, there remains the question, how to love in the century of anxiety, in a time when relationships are fast, fragile, and marked by fear of losing. The first Nietzschean answer is clear. We need to learn to love more honestly. This means abandoning the romantic fantasies that imprison us in unrealistic expectations. The idea that someone will come to save us, that there exists a perfect half waiting for us, that love must last forever, all of this is nothing but fiction. While we insist on these beliefs, we will be condemned to frustration and resentment. Loving honestly is recognizing that the other is imperfect, that we are imperfect, and that still we choose to meet. The second answer is learning to endure one's own solitude. In a hyper-connected world where the absence of messages already generates panic, solitude has become almost unbearable. But Nietzsche reminds us that it is the terrain where the strongest love flourishes. Without solitude, only dependence exists. Reconstructing love in the century of anxiety requires relearning to be alone without losing ourselves in the despair of needing the other to confirm our value. It is in solitude that we find the source that allows us to overflow. The third answer is accepting love as creation and not as contract. Many still see relationships as rigid agreements. You give me this, I give you that, and together we maintain stability. But for Nietzsche, life is movement, and love must accompany this flow. It is not about guaranteeing eternity, but creating continuously. Each encounter, each gesture, each choice is a work in itself, and not a debt to be paid. Reconstructing love is exchanging the language of always for the language of now, understanding that intensity is worth more than empty promise. The century of anxiety is marked by haste. We love with fear of losing. We run after guarantees. We demand immediate answers. Nietzsche proposes the opposite. Slow down, breathe, trust life's flow. Love that liberates doesn't fear time because it doesn't lean on contracts. It feeds on living presence, not future expectation. It is love that doesn't ask until when, but surrenders to the present moment with all intensity. In daily life, this can seem revolutionary. It means not transforming the other into solution to our wounds. It means not making the relationship a field of endless demands. It means, above all, taking responsibility for our own happiness. The other can be source of joy, inspiration, strength, but will never be the sole reason for our existence. When we deposit all our weight on the partner, love becomes unbearable. Reconstructing it is learning to carry our own burdens. Nietzsche believed that life is made of affirmations, and love, when lived affirmatively, is not prison, but expansion. It is not born from need, but from abundance, not born from fear, but from courage. This is the challenge that the century of anxiety imposes on us, transforming our relationships into spaces of freedom and not suffocation. Perhaps Nietzsche's greatest provocation is this: truly loving is risking. It is risking losing, risking suffering, risking not being reciprocated. But without risk, there is no life, and without life, there is no love. Affirmative love doesn't seek guarantees, because it knows that guarantees kill intensity. It prefers to live in the danger of impermanence than hide in the illusion of eternity. Reconstructing love, therefore, is liberating it from the chains that the modern century imposed on it. It is accepting that loving is not completing oneself, but overflowing. Not depending, but choosing. Not dominating, but sharing freedom. In the end, Nietzsche invites us to be strong enough to love without illusions, to love without resentments, to love without fear. Modern love promised us security, but Nietzsche offers us something greater: vitality. It is up to us to choose. Do we want the false peace of emotional prisons, or the dangerous intensity of love that liberates? Throughout this journey, we have seen that Nietzsche dismantles our most intimate illusions about love. He showed us that love can be a mask of power, escape from solitude, field of resentment. But he also showed us that, if born from strength, it can be freedom, creation, and overflowing of life. Now the question returns to you. What was the belief about love that most imprisoned you until today? Which city are you watching from? Comment down below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel to continue this journey through philosophy's most provocative thinking.